The worst betrayal is never committed by a stranger. It comes from the person who already knows where your heart lives. I never imagined those words would become the story of my own life until the morning my phone rang just after sunrise. The voice on the other end was calm, almost rehearsed. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett. This is a courtesy call to remind you that the property transfer is scheduled for tomorrow at 9 o'clock. We just wanted to make sure you'll have the keys ready for the new owners." For a moment I thought they had the wrong number. I glanced through the kitchen window at the old white oak standing proudly in the front yard, its branches stretching over the porch where my late wife, Eleanor, and I had spent countless evenings watching the sun disappear behind the hills. The house had been ours for nearly 48 years. Every inch of it carried a memory. The faded scratch near the hallway was where our son Daniel had ridden his toy truck into the wall when he was 5. The porch swing still creaked with the same gentle rhythm Eleanor loved on cool autumn evenings. Even the smell of fresh pine inside the workshop reminded me of the cabinets we had built together before arthritis slowed my hands. "I'm sorry," I replied carefully, convinced there had been some terrible mistake. "My house isn't for sale." There was a brief silence before the woman spoke again, her confidence fading just enough for me to notice. "Sir, according to our records, all documents have already been signed and recorded. The closing was completed last Friday." My heart didn't race. It simply became heavy. There are moments in life when shock doesn't arrive like lightning. It settles quietly, like snow covering everything familiar until you no longer recognize the landscape. I thanked the caller, hung up, and stood perfectly still in my kitchen. The coffee I'd poured only minutes earlier had already gone cold. I walked slowly to the hallway cabinet where Eleanor had always insisted we keep every important document neatly organized. Birth certificates. Insurance papers. Tax records. Property deeds. Everything was exactly where she had left it before cancer took her 5 years earlier. I found the folder marked home and carefully opened it with hands that suddenly felt much older than 72. The deed was gone. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I had moved it. Maybe attorney Sarah Collins still had it after updating my estate plan a few months before. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation waiting just beyond my imagination. Then another memory surfaced, one so ordinary I had barely noticed it at the time. About 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had stopped by after work carrying a stack of papers. He smiled, poured us both coffee, and explained that his bank needed a few signatures connected to some refinancing paperwork because my name was still attached to an old family trust. "Nothing complicated, Dad," he'd said with the same reassuring smile I'd trusted since the day I first taught him how to ride a bicycle. "Just routine paperwork." I hadn't even put on my reading glasses. I signed where he pointed, more interested in asking about my granddaughter Emma's upcoming school concert than examining legal language I believed my own son would never use against me. That memory now sat in my chest like a stone. I called Daniel's phone once. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. I sent a short message asking him to call me as soon as possible. Minutes passed without a reply. Outside, a pickup truck slowed in front of my house before continuing down the road. For the first time in nearly half a century, I looked at my own front porch and wondered whether someone else believed it already belonged to them. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even ready to believe my own thoughts. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Somewhere between my trust and my signature, something had happened that I didn't understand, and deep inside, a quiet voice whispered the truth I wasn't ready to face: my own son had sold my house behind my back. I remained standing in the kitchen for what felt like an hour, although the old clock above the stove insisted only a few minutes had passed. Time behaves differently when certainty begins to disappear. Every familiar sound inside the house suddenly carried a different meaning. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots. Outside, a pair of robins landed beneath the old oak tree, searching through fallen leaves just as they had every autumn for years. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same anymore. I slowly walked through each room, almost as if I were seeing my own home for the first time. The living room fireplace still displayed the stone Eleanor and I had chosen together after saving for nearly 2 years. Above the mantel rested a framed photograph taken during our 25th wedding anniversary. Eleanor had laughed because the wind kept blowing her hair across her face, and I remembered telling her she looked even more beautiful that way. Beside the picture stood another frame showing Daniel as a young boy proudly holding the first wooden birdhouse we had built together one summer afternoon. I could still remember the smell of fresh pine filling the garage while his tiny hands struggled to hold a hammer twice their size. Back then he believed I could fix anything. Somewhere along the years, life had quietly changed that little boy into a man carrying burdens I did not fully understand. Daniel had always worked hard. After graduating from college, he found a stable job in commercial construction. He married Melissa, and together they welcomed their daughter Emma, who had inherited Eleanor's bright smile and endless curiosity. Like many young families, they carried a mortgage, school expenses, medical bills, and every unexpected cost that seemed to arrive at exactly the wrong time. Whenever Daniel spoke about work during our Sunday dinners, I noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath his smile. He rarely complained, but I often caught him staring silently into his coffee before changing the subject. Eleanor used to tell me that pride was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. He wanted to solve every problem himself, even when asking for help would have been the wiser choice. After Eleanor passed away, I offered several times to let Daniel move back into the house if money ever became too tight. He always refused with a polite smile. "You and Mom worked your whole lives for this place, Dad," he would say. "I will figure things out." I believed him because that was exactly how I had raised him. Independence mattered. Responsibility mattered. Keeping your word mattered. Perhaps I trusted those lessons so deeply that I never imagined they could be overshadowed by desperation. My thoughts drifted back to the afternoon 3 weeks earlier when Daniel had visited carrying that folder of documents. We had not talked much about paperwork. Instead, we spent nearly an hour discussing Emma's upcoming piano recital and whether the tomato plants in my backyard would survive the first frost. Melissa had called during his visit, reminding him about another appointment, and he had gathered the papers quickly before thanking me for helping. Everything about that afternoon had seemed ordinary. That was the part one could not stop replaying. Betrayal rarely announces itself. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary moments so convincingly that you only recognize it after looking backward. I reached for the old wooden box Eleanor had given me on our 40th anniversary. Inside were letters, photographs, and small keepsakes collected across nearly 5 decades together. Resting on top was a simple brass key tied with a faded blue ribbon. Eleanor had smiled when she handed it to me years ago and said, "Never lose this. Someday it may remind you that every locked door has another way in." At the time I thought she was only speaking about the storage cabinet in the workshop. Standing there alone, holding that worn key in my hand, I found myself wondering whether she had understood something about life that I was only beginning to learn. The following morning arrived with the kind of quiet that usually brought me comfort. Instead, every peaceful sound seemed to ask a question I could not answer. I woke before sunrise, just as I had every day since retiring from the carpentry shop 12 years earlier. Habit carried me through the familiar routine. I ground fresh coffee beans, filled the old kettle, and stepped onto the back porch while the first light stretched across the fields behind the house. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves and freshly cut hay from a neighboring farm. Normally, Eleanor would have smiled and said it was the perfect morning to begin something new. Instead, I found myself wondering whether I was about to lose the place where every beginning and every ending of my adult life had happened. I decided there was only one person who might help me separate fear from fact. I drove into town and parked outside the small brick office belonging to attorney Sarah Collins. She had handled our estate planning after Eleanor passed away and knew every legal document connected to our property. Sarah greeted me with the same calm professionalism she always carried. The moment she saw my expression, her smile faded into concern. I explained everything from the unexpected phone call to the missing deed and the signatures I had given Daniel only weeks earlier. She listened without interrupting, occasionally writing short notes before opening my file on her computer. After several minutes, she looked back at me thoughtfully. "Harold, I remember reviewing your estate plan," she said carefully. "But I have not handled any sale involving your property." Those words did not comfort me. They only deepened the mystery. Sarah requested the county property records while I sat silently across from her desk watching the printer slowly produce page after page of public filings. Every sheet seemed to carry more weight than the last. Finally she placed the documents into a neat stack and frowned. "According to these records, ownership has already been transferred," she said quietly. "Everything appears to have been processed legally." I felt the room become strangely still. Sarah continued studying each page with unusual concentration, as though searching for something that did not quite fit. She did not make any conclusions. Instead, she asked me to describe exactly what happened the day Daniel brought the paperwork to my house. I recalled every detail I could remember. The coffee we shared. Emma's piano recital. Melissa calling his phone. The conversation about tomato plants. The papers I signed without reading because I trusted my own son more than any document placed in front of me. Sarah leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "Trust is not evidence," she said gently. "But neither is suspicion. Before we assume anything, we need every document involved." She asked whether Daniel had left me with copies. I shook my head. He had collected every page before leaving that afternoon. Sarah nodded slowly, then reached for her telephone. She requested certified copies from the county clerk and arranged to review every filing line by line as soon as they arrived. Before I left, she offered one final piece of advice. "Do not confront Daniel yet," she said. "If there has been a misunderstanding, emotions will only make the truth harder to find. And if there has not been a misunderstanding, facts will serve you better than anger." Driving home, I replayed those words again and again. I wanted to believe there had been some terrible mistake, some missing explanation that would allow everything to return to the ordinary life I had known only yesterday. But as I turned onto my quiet country road, I noticed a real estate survey stake planted near the edge of my front yard where none had ever stood before. Someone had already begun measuring a future that did not seem to include me. I parked my truck beside the weathered red barn behind the house and remained in the driver's seat longer than I intended. The wooden survey stake near the front yard stayed fixed in my mind like an unwelcome guest refusing to leave. I had lived on this land for almost 50 years, yet for the first time I felt like a visitor waiting for permission to walk through my own front door. I stepped onto the porch and instinctively reached beneath the flower pot where Eleanor always kept the spare house key. The key was still there, exactly where she had left it years ago. Somehow that simple discovery offered more comfort than it should have. A home is not only walls and paperwork. It is routine, memory, and the quiet confidence that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Inside, I walked from room to room once again, paying closer attention than ever before. Near the hallway closet I noticed a small envelope tucked beneath a stack of old utility bills. It contained a recent property tax statement addressed to me alone. Nothing on the document suggested that ownership had changed. That small detail gave me the first fragile thread of hope since receiving the phone call. If the transfer had truly been completed weeks ago, why had the county still mailed the tax notice directly to me? I immediately called Sarah Collins and explained what I had found. She asked me to bring the envelope to her office before the end of the afternoon. When I arrived, she compared the mailing date with the public records she had printed earlier that morning. She remained silent for nearly a minute, studying every line with careful attention. Finally she looked up. "This does not prove the transfer was invalid," she said, "but it does suggest the timeline may not be as straightforward as it appears." She pointed toward two different filing dates that did not perfectly align. One document had been recorded surprisingly quickly, while another seemed delayed by several business days. The inconsistency was small, almost invisible to anyone casually reviewing the paperwork, yet Sarah refused to ignore it. She requested additional certified records from the county clerk, including every attachment submitted with the transfer package. As we waited for the documents, I asked the question I had been avoiding all day. "Do you think Daniel did this intentionally?" Sarah folded her hands before answering. "I think people under extraordinary pressure sometimes make decisions they would never consider during ordinary times. Until we have every fact, I am not willing to judge his intentions." Her response sounded reasonable, but it did little to quiet the storm inside me. Driving home once again, I decided not to call Daniel. I wanted to hear his voice more than anything, yet I also feared that one careless conversation might destroy whatever chance remained to uncover the complete truth. That evening Emma called unexpectedly. Her cheerful voice filled the quiet kitchen as she excitedly told me about practicing a new piano piece for an upcoming recital. She asked whether I would still be sitting in my usual seat during the performance. I smiled despite everything weighing on my heart and promised that I would be there. Before ending the call she paused for a moment and said something that caught me completely off guard. "Grandpa, Daddy has been acting really strange lately. He keeps looking for an old brown document box. He says he cannot remember where he saw it last." My heart skipped a beat. The old wooden box containing Eleanor's letters and the brass key had never left my bedroom. Until that moment, I had believed only I knew it still existed. Emma's words echoed through the silent kitchen long after our call ended. Daniel was searching for the old wooden document box. Until that moment, I had assumed the box was nothing more than a collection of family memories that only mattered to me. Now I could not stop wondering why he believed it was important enough to search for. I carried the box from my bedroom to the kitchen table and carefully lifted the worn brass latch. The familiar scent of aged cedar and old paper drifted into the room. Everything appeared exactly as I remembered. Eleanor's handwritten letters rested beneath several black and white family photographs. A folded church bulletin from her memorial service remained tucked beside our wedding invitation. The small brass key tied with its faded blue ribbon still lay on top as though waiting patiently for someone to notice it. I examined every item more carefully than ever before. Beneath a stack of birthday cards, I discovered a thin envelope I did not recognize. Eleanor's graceful handwriting covered the front with only 3 words. "For Harold only." My hands hesitated before opening it. I knew Eleanor had always believed that some conversations belonged to the right moment rather than the right day. Perhaps this was one of them. Inside rested a single handwritten page. She wrote that if I was reading the letter, it meant life had taken an unexpected turn. She reminded me that trust was one of the greatest gifts a family could share, but wisdom required protecting that trust with preparation. Near the bottom of the page she mentioned that the brass key opened something she had asked attorney Sarah Collins to keep safe until it was truly needed. I read those lines 3 times before my heartbeat finally settled into a steady rhythm. Sarah had never mentioned anything about a key or an item held for Eleanor. Early the next morning I drove directly to her office carrying both the letter and the brass key. Sarah looked genuinely surprised when I placed them on her desk. She read Eleanor's handwriting in complete silence before carefully setting the page aside. Then she opened a secure filing cabinet behind her desk and searched through several locked drawers. Finally she removed a small sealed envelope marked with my name in Eleanor's handwriting. Sarah admitted she had completely forgotten about it because Eleanor had instructed her not to discuss it unless I personally presented the brass key. Neither of us spoke while I carefully broke the wax seal. Inside was a safety deposit receipt issued nearly 15 years earlier along with a handwritten note listing the branch of our local bank. Eleanor had written only one sentence beneath it. "Some promises deserve more than one lock." Sarah immediately understood the importance of the discovery. She suggested we visit the bank before making any assumptions. Less than an hour later we sat inside a private viewing room as the bank manager unlocked an old safety deposit box that had remained untouched for years. I slid the brass key into the second lock with trembling hands. The heavy metal door opened slowly. Resting inside was a thick leather document folder, several notarized papers, and one cream-colored envelope bearing Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. Across the front she had written a sentence that instantly changed everything. "Open this only if someone ever tries to take our home without your full understanding." For several long seconds neither Sarah nor I reached for the cream-colored envelope. It rested quietly on the polished wooden table inside the bank's private viewing room, carrying more weight than every legal document beside it. Eleanor had always chosen her words carefully. She never acted out of fear. If she had prepared this years ago, she had done so because she believed wisdom was an expression of love rather than doubt. I slowly opened the envelope and unfolded the neatly written pages inside. Her familiar handwriting instantly transported me back to evenings when she sat beside the living room fireplace writing birthday cards and holiday letters for our family. She began by reminding me that our home had never been our greatest treasure. The people inside it had always mattered more than the walls surrounding them. Then her words became unexpectedly direct. She explained that after watching several friends lose family farms because of misunderstandings, rushed signatures, and financial desperation within their own families, she insisted we strengthen every legal protection surrounding our property. She wanted every important decision to require more than trust alone. Beneath her letter rested several notarized legal documents bearing official county seals and signatures from nearly 15 years earlier. Sarah carefully reviewed each page while I continued reading. Eleanor had worked with Sarah's former law partner to establish additional safeguards connected to our estate plan. One clause immediately caught Sarah's attention. Any transfer involving our primary residence required a separate notarized acknowledgement signed personally by me after receiving an independent legal explanation of the transaction. Without that acknowledgement, any document signed for another purpose could become subject to legal challenge if it had been presented under misleading circumstances. Sarah looked at me with growing concentration. "Harold," she said quietly, "this clause is highly unusual, but it was drafted correctly. I need to compare it with the transfer documents filed by the county." We spread every paper across the table in careful order. Sarah examined each signature, every date, every notary stamp, and every attached page. Suddenly she stopped. Her eyes remained fixed on one line near the bottom of the transfer packet. "This acknowledgement is missing," she whispered. I leaned closer, hardly breathing. According to Eleanor's instructions, a completely separate notarized explanation should have accompanied any sale of the property. Yet no such document appeared anywhere inside the certified county records. Sarah had obtained. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried hope instead of despair. Sarah explained that the absence of the acknowledgement did not automatically reverse the transfer, yet it created serious legal questions about whether every required condition had actually been satisfied. She immediately contacted the county clerk requesting confirmation that no supplemental filing had been overlooked. While we waited, I found myself thinking less about legal strategy and more about Daniel. If he had knowingly ignored these requirements, I could not understand why. If he had never known they existed, then perhaps someone else had prepared everything without fully explaining the consequences to him. Late that afternoon the county clerk returned Sarah's call. Every document associated with the property transfer had already been produced. Nothing else existed in the official file. Sarah slowly ended the conversation before turning toward me. "Harold," she said, "we finally have a reason to ask questions instead of making assumptions. And before this is over, I think your son is going to have questions of his own that he never expected to face." Leaving Sarah's office that evening, I carried the leather folder beneath my arm as carefully as if it contained the last remaining piece of my life. The autumn sky had already begun fading into soft shades of orange and gray, and the familiar drive home felt strangely different. For the first time since receiving that unexpected phone call, I no longer felt completely helpless. Questions still surrounded me, but now those questions rested on facts rather than fear. Eleanor had quietly prepared for a future she hoped would never arrive, and somehow her steady wisdom was still guiding me years after her passing. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Daniel's pickup truck parked beneath the old oak tree. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I had not invited him, and he had not called. He stood near the front porch with both hands inside his jacket pockets, staring at the house instead of looking toward the road. He appeared older than I remembered only a week earlier. Dark circles surrounded his tired eyes, and his shoulders carried the weight of someone who had not slept well in many nights. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The evening breeze carried fallen leaves across the yard while the porch swing moved gently on its own. Finally Daniel stepped forward. "Dad," he said quietly, "I have been trying to reach you." I nodded but did not answer immediately. There was no anger in my voice when I finally spoke. I thought it would be better for both of us to wait until I understood what was happening. Daniel lowered his eyes. "I know how this looks," he replied. "But there are things you do not know." Those words echoed inside my mind. They were almost identical to the thoughts I had repeated to myself since this nightmare began. I invited him inside without another word. We sat at the same kitchen table where he had asked me to sign the documents only weeks before. The coffee mugs rested between us exactly as they had that afternoon, yet everything else had changed. Daniel stared at the tabletop before finally speaking again. He admitted that his financial situation had become far worse than anyone in the family realized. Unexpected medical expenses, rising mortgage payments, and a failing business investment had placed him under enormous pressure. Several months earlier he had been introduced to a real estate consultant who claimed there was a legal way to refinance family property temporarily without anyone losing ownership. Daniel insisted that the arrangement had been described as a bridge loan rather than a permanent sale. He believed the paperwork would simply allow enough time to recover financially before everything returned to normal. I listened without interrupting, carefully watching his face instead of his words. He did not sound like a man inventing excuses. He sounded like someone slowly discovering that he had trusted the wrong people. When I asked whether he had read every page before bringing them to me, he became painfully quiet. After several seconds he shook his head. "I trusted them," he whispered. "Just like you trusted me." The room fell silent once more. I placed Eleanor's letter on the table but kept the leather folder closed. Daniel stared at the envelope without recognizing it. Then I asked him one question that immediately changed the expression on his face. "Tell me honestly, Daniel. Who told you to find the old wooden document box?" Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the worn envelope lying between us as though he were trying to remember something buried beneath months of anxiety. Finally he let out a slow breath and rubbed both hands across his face. "It was the consultant," he admitted quietly. "About a week ago he called me and asked whether there were any old family records, estate papers, or document boxes that belonged to Mom. He said sometimes older property files contained duplicate paperwork that could delay refinancing." Every word settled heavily inside the room. Sarah had warned me that facts would eventually speak louder than assumptions. Now those facts were beginning to form a pattern. "What was his name?" I asked. Daniel answered without hesitation. "Richard Lawson." The name meant nothing to me, but I noticed Daniel studying my expression, almost hoping I would somehow recognize it and explain everything away. Instead I simply nodded. "Did he ever meet me?" Daniel shook his head. "No. He always said everything should go through me because he did not want to burden you with complicated legal language." I looked toward the family photographs hanging beside the dining room doorway. Eleanor had often reminded me that honest people welcomed questions while dishonest people tried to eliminate them. The more Daniel spoke, the more I realized he had been carefully separated from independent advice every step of the way. I reached across the table and slid Eleanor's letter toward him. "Read this," I said softly. Daniel unfolded the pages with trembling hands. As he moved through each paragraph, the color slowly drained from his face. By the time he reached the final page, his eyes had filled with quiet regret. He looked up at me and whispered, "Mom knew this could happen. I gently corrected him. She hoped it never would. There is a difference. Those words lingered between us. For the first time since the nightmare began, I no longer saw a son hiding secrets. I saw a frightened man realizing that his desperation had been carefully manipulated by someone who understood exactly which promises to make. Daniel confessed that every conversation with Richard Lawson had focused on speed. There had always been another deadline, another signature, another urgent reason why delays could ruin everything. Looking back, he admitted that every decision had been designed to prevent careful thinking. I asked whether he still had Richard's business card or contract. Daniel immediately reached into his wallet and handed me a folded receipt containing a telephone number and office address written in blue ink. The company name printed across the top read Lawson Property Financial Solutions. I carefully placed the receipt inside the leather folder beside Eleanor's documents. Every piece of evidence now belonged together. Before either of us could speak again, my telephone rang. Sarah Collins appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. Her voice sounded unusually focused. "Harold, I just received something from the county clerk," she said. "There is no missing acknowledgement document because one was never filed. However, another detail has appeared that neither of us noticed earlier. The notary public listed on the transfer paperwork resigned his commission nearly 6 months before your documents were supposedly notarized." Silence filled the kitchen. Daniel slowly closed his eyes. Sarah continued speaking. "Tomorrow morning I want both of you in my office. We are no longer trying to understand what happened. We are beginning to understand how it happened." The next morning arrived beneath a cold gray sky that matched the uncertainty hanging over every conversation. Daniel followed my truck into town without saying much during the drive. Neither of us turned on the radio. We passed familiar farms, the old church where Eleanor and I had exchanged our vows decades earlier, and the small diner where our family had celebrated birthdays for years. Every place carried memories untouched by legal documents or financial schemes. It reminded me that whatever happened next, the true value of a family could never be measured on a property deed. Sarah Collins was already waiting when we entered her office. Several large folders covered her conference table alongside printed county records, notarization logs, and copies of every document connected to the transfer. She invited us to sit before quietly placing one additional file in front of Daniel. "I spent most of last night researching Richard Lawson," she began. "He is not licensed as a real estate attorney, and he has never been registered as a mortgage broker in this state." Daniel stared at the paperwork without speaking. Sarah continued. "His company has changed names 3 times during the past 8 years. None of those businesses remain active today." She slid another document toward us. It contained public business filings showing multiple dissolved companies connected to the same mailing address. Daniel slowly rubbed his forehead. "He told me his firm specialized in helping families avoid foreclosure," he whispered. Sarah nodded. "That may have been how he introduced himself to many people." She then pointed toward another page showing the expired notary commission we had discussed the previous evening. The official commission had ended 6 months before our documents were supposedly notarized. Sarah explained that anyone presenting notarized documents after that expiration would face serious legal scrutiny because the authentication itself could be challenged. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw genuine determination replacing confusion inside Daniel's eyes. He was no longer defending what had happened. He wanted to understand who had orchestrated it. Sarah asked him to describe every meeting with Richard Lawson from the beginning. Daniel recalled coffee shop conversations, telephone calls, and one visit to a small office building on the edge of town. Each meeting had followed the same pattern. Richard always insisted that time was running out, paperwork had to be completed immediately, and outside legal advice would only slow everything down. Sarah quietly wrote notes after every detail. When Daniel finished, she folded her notebook closed. "This is beginning to resemble a carefully structured deception rather than a simple business disagreement," she said. Before anyone could respond, her assistant entered the conference room carrying a freshly delivered certified envelope from the county recorder's office. Sarah opened it immediately. Inside was the original scanned image of the property transfer package exactly as it had been submitted. She examined each page before stopping suddenly. Her expression changed completely. "Harold," she said, turning the final sheet toward me, "look at the witness signature." I leaned closer until the ink became perfectly clear. The signature belonged to someone I recognized instantly. It was not Richard Lawson. It was not the expired notary. It was someone our family had trusted for more than 20 years, a familiar name that neither Daniel nor I ever expected to find anywhere near those documents. Neither Daniel nor I spoke as we stared at the witness signature. A name that had once represented trust now carried an entirely different weight. It belonged to Michael Turner, the longtime manager of the small community bank where Eleanor and I had opened our first savings account nearly 40 years earlier. He had attended neighborhood picnics, donated to church fundraisers, and shaken my hand more times than I could remember. If his signature truly appeared on the transfer documents, then this situation reached far beyond one dishonest consultant. Sarah remained calm while studying the paperwork once again. "We cannot assume Michael knowingly participated," she said. "A signature tells us someone was involved. It does not yet tell us why." Daniel slowly nodded, but the disappointment on his face was impossible to hide. "He introduced me to Richard Lawson," he admitted quietly. "He said Richard specialized in helping families solve temporary financial problems without losing their homes." Sarah wrote another note before asking a simple question. "Did Michael personally attend any meeting where your father signed documents?" Daniel immediately answered no. Michael had only made the introduction. Every later conversation had taken place between Daniel and Richard Lawson alone. Sarah leaned back in her chair, thinking carefully before speaking again. "Then we begin with Michael. If he acted honestly, he may provide answers. If he did not, the records will eventually reveal that as well." Before leaving the office, Sarah telephoned the bank and requested a meeting with Michael that afternoon. To my surprise, he agreed without hesitation. 3 hours later Daniel and I walked into the familiar brick bank where Eleanor and I had deposited our paychecks for decades. The polished marble floor, the old brass teller windows, and the grandfather clock in the lobby all looked exactly as they always had. Only my confidence had changed. Michael welcomed us into his office with his usual polite smile, but the expression disappeared the moment he saw the stack of documents Sarah placed on his desk. He adjusted his reading glasses and carefully examined the witness signature. For several long seconds he said nothing. Finally he looked directly at Sarah. "This is my signature," he admitted. "But I never witnessed Harold Bennett signing any property transfer." Daniel and I exchanged a stunned glance. Michael continued before anyone interrupted him. He explained that several months earlier Richard Lawson had brought him what appeared to be a completed refinancing package requiring only witness verification that certain identification documents had already been reviewed elsewhere. Michael insisted he had never seen the final transfer agreement, never met with me, and never imagined the paperwork involved the sale of my home. Sarah immediately asked whether copies of those earlier documents still existed inside the bank. Michael shook his head. The files had never been processed by the bank because Richard claimed private investors would finance the transaction instead. Michael had simply believed he was confirming identity paperwork connected to a refinancing application. The room became completely silent. Richard Lawson had carefully separated every participant so that no one possessed the complete picture. Daniel lowered his head and quietly apologized to Michael for bringing him into the situation. Michael looked toward me with genuine regret. "Harold," he said softly. "If I had known what those papers truly were, I would never have signed anything." Before anyone could respond, Sarah's telephone vibrated. She answered immediately, listened for only a few moments, then looked directly at us. "The county investigator has just returned my call," she said. "Richard Lawson closed his office yesterday morning." Every phone number connected to his company has already been disconnected. The news that Richard Lawson had disappeared settled over us like a heavy storm cloud. For several moments no one inside the bank manager's office moved. Michael Turner slowly lowered himself into his chair, staring through the window toward the quiet streets of our small town. "If he closed everything yesterday," he said softly, "then he knew someone was getting close." Sarah nodded without taking her eyes off the county investigator's notes. She explained that offices do not simply disappear overnight unless someone has already begun planning an exit. Every missing telephone number, every dissolved company, and every abandoned address suggested preparation rather than panic. Daniel looked down at his hands. "This is my fault," he whispered. "If I had asked one more question, none of this would have happened." I shook my head before anyone else could answer. "No," I said quietly. "The fault belongs to the person who earned trust only to misuse it. Regret will not change yesterday, but truth can still protect tomorrow." Daniel looked at me with the same expression he wore as a little boy after making an honest mistake. For the first time in weeks, I saw relief mixed with sorrow instead of fear. Sarah gathered every document into a single organized folder before suggesting our next step. "Richard Lawson may have disappeared," she explained, "but paper records rarely disappear completely. Every property transfer leaves a trail. Every bank transaction leaves another. Someone received money. Someone prepared these documents. Someone benefited." Those words reminded me of something Eleanor often said while balancing our household finances. She believed numbers always told the truth if people were patient enough to read them carefully. Before leaving the bank, Michael offered to search through archived visitor logs and security records. Although the bank had never processed the transaction itself, he hoped there might still be information showing when Richard Lawson had entered the building or who accompanied him during earlier meetings. Sarah thanked him and promised to coordinate directly with the county investigator. As Daniel and I walked toward the parking lot, the afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds for the first time that day. Neither of us spoke until we reached our trucks. Daniel suddenly remembered something that made him stop walking. "Dad," he said, "Richard always carried the same leather notebook. Every meeting, every phone call, every appointment, he wrote something inside it. He never let anyone see the pages." Sarah immediately looked interested. "Did you ever notice anything unusual about it?" Daniel thought for several seconds before answering. "Only one thing. Every time he finished writing, he tucked a business card into the back cover. I thought it was his own card, but once I accidentally saw a different name printed there before he closed it." Sarah asked whether Daniel remembered the name. He closed his eyes, searching through his memory. Slowly he nodded. "I do not remember the full name, but I remember the first word. It said Hawthorne." Sarah immediately opened her laptop and searched local property records. Less than a minute later she turned the screen toward us. A recently purchased office building on the edge of the neighboring county was owned by a company called Hawthorne Property Holdings. The purchase had been completed only 2 weeks earlier. Then Sarah noticed something even more surprising. The mailing address listed for the company matched the return address printed on the envelope that had originally delivered the property transfer documents to the county recorder. The discovery of the Hawthorne Property Holdings address changed the direction of everything. Until that moment we had been looking backward, trying to understand what had already happened. Now, for the first time, we had somewhere to look next. Sarah printed every public record connected to the company while Daniel and I remained in her office reviewing timelines, signatures, and dates. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Richard Lawson had formed new companies just before acquiring properties, dissolved them shortly afterward, and moved to another business name before questions could catch up with him. Each transaction appeared ordinary by itself, but together they revealed a carefully organized system built on confusion rather than transparency. Sarah explained that investigators often solve complicated cases by finding the one mistake no one expected to matter. People can hide money, she said, and they can hide identities for a while, but they rarely hide time. Dates always tell a story. She arranged every document across the conference table in chronological order. As we studied the sequence, another inconsistency appeared. Hawthorne Property Holdings had officially purchased the office building 2 weeks before my property transfer was recorded. Yet according to Daniel's memory, Richard Lawson had already been meeting clients inside that office nearly a month earlier. That meant he had been operating from a building his company did not legally own at the time. Sarah immediately circled the dates with a red pen. Either someone else controlled that office before the purchase, she said, or the paperwork was prepared long before it was officially filed. Both possibilities raised even more questions. The county investigator agreed to meet us the following morning and requested copies of every document Eleanor had preserved inside the safety deposit box. As Sarah organized the evidence, I quietly unfolded Eleanor's letter once more. Her final paragraph suddenly carried a meaning I had overlooked before. She had written that the greatest protection was never a locked door or a signed paper. It was patient truth, because patient truth eventually forced every hidden story into the light. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the leather folder. Daniel watched me in silence before speaking. "Dad," he said softly, "if Mom had not prepared all of this years ago, we would have believed everything was already over." I looked toward the courthouse clock tower outside Sarah's office window. "Your mother believed hope should always have a plan," I replied. Late that afternoon we drove past the Hawthorne Property Holdings building without stopping. It stood alone near the edge of the neighboring county, a modern brick office with dark reflective windows and an almost empty parking lot. No company signs remained on the entrance, yet fresh tire tracks crossed the gravel driveway. Someone had been there recently. Daniel slowed the truck as we passed, but Sarah advised against approaching the property before investigators arrived. As we turned back toward the highway, I glanced into the side mirror one final time. A black sport utility vehicle quietly pulled out from behind the office building and merged onto the road several hundred yards behind us. At first I assumed it belonged to another traveler. Then I noticed something unsettling. Every time we changed lanes or turned onto another road, the same vehicle made the exact same move, never getting closer, never falling farther behind. Investigator Mercer allowed the silence to linger after revealing that the man Daniel identified had never legally used the name Richard Lawson. The realization settled over everyone in the room with unsettling clarity. We had not simply been following a dishonest businessman. We had been chasing someone who had carefully built an entire identity designed to disappear whenever necessary. Mercer explained that the photograph came from an investigation several years earlier involving questionable property transfers in another state. The man had been interviewed but never charged because every witness knew him by a different name, every company had already been dissolved, and every transaction appeared technically complete before victims realized what had happened. "He survives by staying one step ahead of confusion," Mercer said. "He does not rely on force. He relies on people believing there is nothing they can do once the paperwork is signed." Sarah quietly opened Eleanor's leather folder and placed the special acknowledgement clause beside the investigator's file. This time, she replied calmly, "He stepped into a situation where someone anticipated confusion years before he arrived." Mercer carefully read the document again before looking directly at me. "Your wife may have preserved the one legal safeguard this man never expected to encounter." Daniel lowered his head, overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had unfolded. I rested my hand gently on his shoulder. There was no anger left inside me. Only the determination to finish what Eleanor had unknowingly started. Mercer then spread several enlarged maps across the conference table. Red circles marked properties connected to the same pattern of suspicious transfers. Every location formed a loose line across neighboring counties, ending with the Hawthorne Property Holdings office we had driven past only a day earlier. Sarah noticed something immediately. Most of the properties had belonged to elderly owners who trusted relatives, longtime acquaintances, or financial advisors before signing complicated paperwork. Mercer nodded. "He did not choose buildings," he said. "He chose relationships." Those words struck harder than any legal document. This had never been only about land. It had been about exploiting trust itself. Just before the meeting ended, Mercer's assistant entered carrying a newly printed report from the state vehicle database. The rental sport utility vehicle that had followed us had been returned only 45 minutes earlier at a regional airport nearly 60 miles away. Security cameras showed a man leaving the vehicle and boarding a commercial flight under another false identity. Mercer immediately contacted federal investigators, believing the suspect might still be intercepted before leaving the country. As everyone gathered their papers, Mercer stopped Daniel near the doorway. "There is one more thing," he said. "Yesterday we executed a search warrant at the abandoned Hawthorne office." Daniel turned quickly. Mercer handed him a clear evidence bag containing a small leather notebook with worn corners. Daniel's eyes widened instantly. "That is it," he whispered. "That is the notebook Richard carried everywhere." Mercer nodded. It was hidden inside a ceiling panel. Sarah carefully opened the notebook. Most of its pages contained coded numbers and abbreviated notes that meant nothing to us. Then she reached the final page. Tucked inside the back cover was the business card Daniel remembered seeing months earlier. It belonged to an attorney. Across the bottom, written in blue ink by the suspect's own hand, appeared a single sentence that immediately changed the direction of the investigation once again. It read, "Do not proceed until Bennett signs the final page." The confirmation that federal agents had intercepted the man before he disappeared again brought an unfamiliar feeling into the room. For the first time since this ordeal began, hope stood on equal ground with uncertainty. Investigator Mercer cautioned us that an arrest alone would not resolve the legal questions surrounding my property. The evidence still had to be organized, verified, and presented through the proper legal process. However, he believed the investigation had reached a turning point because the suspect could no longer control the story by simply vanishing behind another false identity. Sarah quietly closed the evidence folder and looked toward Daniel. "Now we stop chasing him," she said. "Now we let the facts chase him." The following morning we met once again inside Sarah's conference room. Every document collected over the previous week covered the large oak table in perfect chronological order. Eleanor's handwritten letter rested at the center, surrounded by the property records, notarized estate documents, county filings, witness statements, business registrations, and the recovered notebook. Looking at everything together, I realized that no single document had saved our home. It was the combination of patience, preparation, and truth that had created a complete picture impossible to ignore. Mercer arrived carrying a sealed evidence binder containing the first official interview conducted after the suspect's arrest. Although many details remained confidential, one statement immediately captured everyone's attention. The suspect admitted that he never intended to complete the transfer without obtaining my final acknowledgement because he understood the earlier documents alone could be challenged in court. He believed that once enough pressure surrounded the transaction, I would eventually agree to sign whatever additional paperwork he presented simply to avoid conflict within my own family. Daniel lowered his eyes after hearing those words. I gently placed my hand on his shoulder. "He misunderstood this family," I said quietly. "He thought pressure would divide us. Instead it forced us to stand together." Mercer smiled slightly before opening another folder. Inside was the preliminary legal opinion from the county attorney's office. Based on the missing acknowledgement, the expired notary commission, the fraudulent identities, and the developing criminal investigation, officials intended to petition the court to suspend every legal effect of the disputed transfer until the case could be fully resolved. Sarah explained that this did not represent a final judgment, but it prevented any further attempt to sell, refinance, or transfer my home while the investigation continued. It was the first official protection granted since everything had begun. When we left the office that afternoon, Daniel insisted on driving with me back to the house. We parked beneath the old oak tree where Eleanor had once stood smiling in the faded photograph now resting safely inside the wooden document box. Emma was already waiting on the front porch after school. The moment she saw us together, she ran across the yard and wrapped her arms around both of us without asking a single question. Children often recognized healing long before adults found the words to describe it. As the evening sun settled across the fields behind the house, I sat quietly on the porch swing Eleanor and I had built together many years earlier. Daniel joined me without speaking. We watched the wind carry golden leaves across the front yard while the familiar sounds of home slowly returned. For the first time in many days, the house no longer felt like something waiting to be taken away. It felt exactly as Eleanor had always believed it should be, a place where truth, patience, and family would eventually find one another again. Several weeks passed before the courtroom hearing finally arrived. By then the autumn leaves had almost completely disappeared from the old oak tree outside my house, leaving its strong branches stretching toward the cold morning sky. Sarah met Daniel and me on the courthouse steps carrying the same leather folder that had traveled with us through every stage of this journey. Eleanor's letter rested safely inside beside the brass key, the notarized estate documents, the county records, and every piece of evidence gathered by investigator Mercer. Looking at that familiar folder, I realized it represented far more than legal paperwork. It represented years of quiet wisdom waiting patiently for the day it would be needed. Inside the courtroom the proceedings remained calm and respectful. The judge carefully reviewed the evidence presented by both sides. Sarah explained the missing acknowledgement requirement, the expired notary commission, the false identities, the dissolved companies, and the evidence recovered from the abandoned Hawthorne office. Mercer testified about the investigation, confirming that the suspect had operated under multiple aliases while targeting property owners through carefully constructed deception. Michael Turner also appeared and honestly described how he had unknowingly signed paperwork believing it related only to identity verification for refinancing. His willingness to admit his mistake without hesitation strengthened the credibility of every other witness. Finally Daniel stood before the court. His voice remained steady even though the emotion behind every word was impossible to miss. He accepted responsibility for trusting someone without verifying the facts. He admitted bringing documents to me without fully understanding them himself. Then he looked directly toward me before addressing the judge. "I never wanted my father to lose his home," he said. "I wanted to save my own family, and I believed someone who promised an easy solution instead of asking difficult questions." The courtroom remained silent after he finished speaking. I knew how much courage those words had required. Sarah concluded by presenting Eleanor's letter and the estate clause she had insisted upon years earlier. She explained that Eleanor had not created obstacles to make life difficult. She had created safeguards because trust deserved protection. After reviewing every exhibit, the judge recessed briefly before returning with a written decision. He ruled that the disputed transfer failed to satisfy the mandatory legal requirements established within the estate documents, that the supporting paperwork contained significant irregularities, and that the criminal investigation further undermined the validity of the transaction. Pending the final resolution of the related criminal case, full ownership and control of my home would remain exactly where it had always belonged. I closed my eyes for only a moment, silently thanking Eleanor for thinking years ahead when the rest of us had been thinking only about tomorrow. Outside the courthouse Daniel walked beside me without speaking until we reached the parking lot. Then he quietly handed me the old spare house key I had once hidden beneath the flower pot on the porch. "I do not want secrets between us anymore," he said. I smiled gently and closed his fingers back around the key. "Then keep it," I replied. "Not because you need permission to enter my home, but because you will always belong there." As we drove back toward the farmhouse together, the afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds once again, illuminating the old White House in the distance exactly as it had on the day Eleanor and I first decided it would become the place where our family would always find its way home. Winter arrived quietly, covering the fields around the farmhouse with a thin blanket of frost that sparkled beneath the morning sun. The legal proceedings eventually reached their conclusion, and the final judgment confirmed every finding the investigation had uncovered. The fraudulent transfers were permanently voided, the criminal conspiracy was fully documented, and every legal right connected to my home remained exactly where Eleanor had always intended. Yet when friends stopped me in town to ask whether I felt victorious, I found myself giving the same answer every time. I never wanted to win against my son. I only wanted my family back. That answer surprised many people, but it reflected the truth more accurately than any courtroom ruling ever could. Daniel changed in ways that no legal decision alone could have accomplished. He sold the failing business that had pushed him into desperation, accepted steady work with a local construction company, and slowly rebuilt his finances one honest paycheck at a time. Every Friday evening he stopped by the farmhouse after work, sometimes carrying fresh groceries, sometimes bringing tools to repair another small project around the property, and sometimes arriving with nothing more than a willingness to spend time together. We rarely spoke about the investigation anymore because we no longer needed to. The lessons remained even when the conversations faded. Sarah Collins also became more than the attorney who helped save my home. She occasionally visited for coffee whenever she happened to be driving through our county, and she often smiled whenever she noticed the old wooden document box resting safely on the bookshelf beside the fireplace. She once admitted that in all her years practicing law, she had rarely seen a single handwritten letter change the direction of an entire case. I smiled and reminded her that Eleanor had always believed preparation was kindness offered to people you might never be able to help in person. One cold Saturday afternoon Emma asked whether we could plant another oak tree beside the original one standing proudly in the front yard. She said every important family story deserved something that would continue growing long after everyone telling it had grown old. Daniel looked at me with a quiet smile before handing me a shovel. Together we dug a small hole only a few yards from the porch where Eleanor and I had built our swing decades earlier. As Emma carefully lowered the young tree into the ground, she whispered that one day her own children would ask why there were 2 oak trees in front of the farmhouse. I told her they would hear a story about courage, patience, mistakes, forgiveness, and a grandmother whose wisdom reached farther into the future than anyone could have imagined. When the work was finished, we stood together in comfortable silence watching the winter breeze move gently through the bare branches of the older tree while the smaller one waited patiently for spring. Before going inside, Daniel quietly reached into his pocket and placed a brand new brass key in my hand. "This one belongs to the new front door lock," he said. I had copies made for everyone in the family. I looked at the shining key for a long moment before placing it beside Eleanor's original key inside the wooden document box. One key represented the past that had protected us. The other represented the future we had chosen to build together. As evening settled across the quiet countryside and warm light filled every window of the old white farmhouse, I finally understood that the greatest inheritance Eleanor had ever left behind was never the house itself. It was the strength to keep our family together when everything else seemed determined to pull it apart.